Richard thought he was the god of Silicon Valley. He built a high-tech fortress and hired a lethal ex-Marine to protect his trophy wife. But while Richard was on a giant screen preaching about total control to his investors, that very Marine was undressing his wife on the office sofa, right in the camera's blind spot. But here is the twisted part: Richard didn't just broadcast his own humiliation, he accidentally funded it. This is the story of how a genius billionaire built the trap that handed his wife, his fortune, and his ego to the man he paid to guard them. The morning sun did not merely rise, it pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse on the 45th floor, flooding the impeccably organized kitchen with a sterile, blinding white light. The air inside the apartment was artificially crisp, carrying the rich, earthy aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and the subtle, metallic scent of an expensive air conditioning system working at maximum capacity. Elizabeth stood motionless by the sprawling marble island, her silhouette sharp against the brightness, watching her husband with a practiced detachment. She was a statue of composure in a home designed for display, observing the chaotic energy of the man who owned it all yet seemed a stranger in his own residence, surrounded by surfaces that gleamed with an aggressive cleanliness. Richard was the archetype of a Silicon Valley genius, a man whose mind was perpetually synchronized with a digital clock rather than biological time. He stood by the counter, struggling to knot a silk tie with one hand while his other hand clutched a tablet as if it were a lifeline in a stormy sea. His shoulders were slightly stooped from decades of leaning over keyboards, and his thick-rimmed glasses kept sliding down his nose as he muttered to himself. He was completely immersed in the cascading rows of numbers on his screen, checking stock quotes and market fluctuations with a desperate intensity, oblivious to the breathtaking view outside or the woman waiting patiently to serve him his breakfast. Between disjointed mutters about share prices, Richard spoke rapidly about the impending corporate merger and the vulnerabilities of their current infrastructure. He insisted that the security algorithms required a massive, immediate update to protect their assets from external threats. With a tone of self-satisfaction, he mentioned that he had finally hired a new specialist, a former Marine with an impeccable service record, to close every potential loop in the system. He described this new chief of security as the best in the business, a human firewall who would ensure that their lives remained impenetrable, unaware that he was describing the very instrument of his own dismantling to the person who would hold the door open. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her expression unreadable as she handed him a glass filled with a thick, green vitamin smoothie. It was a perfect tableau of American success, the wealthy, brilliant husband and the beautiful, supportive wife living their life according to a precise, enviable schedule. Richard took the glass without making eye contact, drinking it mechanically while scrolling through another report. He leaned in to peck her cheek, his eyes never leaving the glowing screen, and announced he would be returning late due to a critical dinner with investors from Asia. With that, he rushed toward the private elevator, leaving a trail of nervous energy in his wake, the doors sliding shut to seal him away from his domestic fortress. She remained alone in the deafening silence of the enormous apartment, the quiet settling around her like a heavy velvet curtain. Elizabeth moved slowly toward the panoramic window, her silk robe trailing on the heated floor, her gaze drifting downward to the sprawling, chaotic anthill of the metropolis far below. From this height, the city looked like a complex circuit board of gray concrete and glinting steel, indifferent and vast. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing the world from inside a glass cage, separated from the grime and the life of the streets by layers of reinforced transparency and wealth. The isolation was absolute, a golden cage that Richard had built to keep the world out and her safely within. The stillness was abruptly broken by the short, aggressive vibration of her mobile phone resting on the marble countertop. The screen lit up, displaying a notification from a number she had not saved but knew by heart. Elizabeth stared at the message, the white letters stark against the dark background. "I see him leaving. Security down. Door open." The words were precise and military, devoid of emotion yet heavy with implication. It was not a question or a greeting, it was a statement of fact that signaled the commencement of a sequence they had silently agreed upon. The notification hung there, a digital key unlocking a reality that had been simmering beneath the surface. That brief, textual intrusion instantly dismantled the peaceful, domestic atmosphere of the morning, shattering the illusion of the loyal wife. Her heart constricted, but not with the panic that should accompany a security breach or a stalker's note. Instead, she felt a dark, viscous wave of anticipation tightening her chest, a thrill that was almost painful in its intensity. The fear of discovery was eclipsed by a hunger for the chaos that was about to walk through her front door. Elizabeth turned her back on the safe, sunlit view of the city and looked toward the entrance, waiting for the inevitable destruction of the harmony she had so carefully pretended to maintain. The corporate headquarters of Richard's technology empire rose from the pavement like a modern cathedral dedicated to the worship of transparency and efficiency, a towering monolith of tempered glass and cold, brushed steel that reflected the city clouds. To the uninitiated, it was a marvel of architecture, but to those who walked its corridors, it was a high-tech hive where individual identity was slowly eroded in service to the greater algorithm. Elizabeth arrived precisely at the lunch hour, stepping out of her car onto the pristine pavement of the drop-off zone, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence that echoed against the imposing facade. She had promised to be here, to play the role of the supportive spouse before Richard's crucial presentation to the board, a performance she had perfected over 5 years of marriage. Entering the lobby felt less like walking into a place of business and more like being swallowed by a giant, sterile organism that hummed with invisible energy. The air was filtered to a degree of purity that felt almost unnatural, devoid of the sense of the city, replaced by the odorless chill of aggressive climate control. Security turnstiles whirred softly, processing badges and biometric data with ruthless efficiency, admitting the drone-like employees who scurried back and forth with coffee cups and tablets. Elizabeth bypassed the main queue, her status granting her access to the executive elevator, a glass capsule that shot upward with stomach-churning speed, lifting her away from the common ground and toward the rarefied air of the leadership levels. When the elevator doors slid open on the penthouse level, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the low murmur of the lobby 40 floors below. She expected to see Richard pacing the reception area, perhaps rehearsing his speech or obsessively adjusting his glasses, his nervous energy usually filling the room before he even spoke. Instead, the space was dominated by a different kind of presence, one that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Standing in the center of the executive waiting area, blocking the path to Richard's office with the immovability of a mountain, was Marcus. He was not wearing the standard gray suit of the corporate drones, his attire was sharp, dark, and tailored to conceal lethal efficiency. The new head of security filled the doorframe in a way Richard never could, his physical dimensions seemingly expanding to consume the available oxygen in the room. He was the polar opposite of her husband in every conceivable metric, a man carved from granite rather than molded from clay. His skin was the color of deep, polished ebony, and his shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of the building itself, a testament to years of physical conditioning that had nothing to do with gym memberships and everything to do with survival. Where Richard projected intellect and anxiety, Marcus projected a calm, kinetic potential for violence that he kept barely leashed beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. Elizabeth halted, her breath catching slightly in her throat, though she masked it with a polite, frozen smile. Marcus did not step aside immediately, he held his ground for a fraction of a second longer than was socially acceptable, forcing her to acknowledge his physicality. His eyes, dark and unreadable, did not merely look at her, they scanned her with the precision of the thermal cameras he monitored, stripping away the social niceties to assess the threat level or perhaps something else entirely. There was a history of combat in his posture, the economical movement of a Marine who had learned that wasted motion could cost a life, and now that predatory focus was entirely locked onto her. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, distinct from the nasal, frantic tones she was used to hearing in this office. He informed her that the CEO was currently locked in an emergency pre-meeting with the legal team and could not be disturbed for another 20 minutes. The refusal was delivered with impeccable politeness, yet there was an underlying firmness that made it clear this was not a negotiation. He gestured with a large hand toward a side door, offering her sanctuary not in the plush guest lounge, but in the central security hub. He suggested it would be quieter there, more private than waiting in the open corridor where the secretaries might gawk. She followed him, the dynamic of their movement shifting instantly from a guest being greeted to a prisoner being escorted, though the chains were invisible. Walking behind him, she was acutely aware of the difference in his gait compared to Richard's hurried, stumbling shuffle. Marcus moved with a fluid, silent grace that was unnerving for a man of his size, his footsteps making no sound on the thick carpeting. They traversed the long, minimalist corridor, passing abstract art that cost more than most houses, yet the only thing Elizabeth could focus on was the broad back of the man leading her into the heart of the building's surveillance system. The security office was a different world entirely, a darkened cave illuminated only by the cold, blue glow of a wall of high-definition monitors. The moment the heavy, soundproof door clicked shut behind them, the sterile atmosphere of the corporate floor vanished, replaced by a low, electronic hum of servers and the feeling of intense, focused observation. Here, the temple of glass revealed its true nature. It was not a place of transparency, but a panopticon where every corner, every desk, and every hallway was under constant scrutiny. Dozens of screens flickered with live feeds, reducing the hundreds of employees outside to unaware data points moving through a maze. Marcus did not offer her a drink or make small talk about the weather. He bypassed the pleasantries that Richard relied on to grease social interactions. He walked to the main console, leaning back against it, crossing his arms over his chest, his silhouette backlit by the mosaic of surveillance feeds. The posture was relaxed but dominant, and for the first time, Elizabeth realized how small the room felt with him inside it. He watched her looking at the screens, his expression unreadable, allowing the silence to stretch until it became a tangible weight in the air, heavy with unsaid things and shifting boundaries. He began to speak about the architecture of the system Richard had designed, his voice dropping to a volume that required her to step closer to hear him over the hum of the cooling fans. He described the encryption and the protocols not with admiration, but with a dripping disdain, calling the entire setup a child's toy painted to look like a fortress. He pointed out blind spots on the monitors, gaps in the coverage that a professional could exploit in seconds, dismantling the myth of Richard's genius with a few callous sentences. It was a brutal deconstruction of her husband's life's work, delivered by the man paid to protect it. Elizabeth felt a flush of heat rising up her neck, a mix of indignation and a strange, paralyzing fascination. She should have defended her husband, should have reprimanded this subordinate for his insolence, but the words died in her throat. Marcus was not speaking like a subordinate, he was speaking like a conqueror surveying a captured city. He pushed off the desk and took a slow, deliberate step toward her, invading her personal space with a casual arrogance that violated every clause of the corporate harassment policy. The air between them seemed to crackle, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. He reached out, not to touch her, but to rest his hand on the back of the leather chair she was standing near, effectively boxing her in. The barrier was psychological as much as physical. He was cutting off her line of retreat, forcing her to remain in his orbit. Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes wide, realizing that the danger radiating from him was not directed at her safety, but at her morality. He was a wolf who had been invited into the sheepfold, and he was done wearing the sheep's clothing. The scent of him, a mix of distinct, masculine musk and gun oil, overwhelmed the sterile smell of the office. "Richard thinks he sees everything," Marcus murmured, his face lowering until it was inches from hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "He thinks numbers and cameras give him control. But he doesn't understand the first thing about real security." His eyes dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes, a slow, deliberate movement that stripped her bare. The critique of the security system had morphed into a critique of Richard's manhood, his inability to hold on to what was his blindness to the reality of human nature. The proximity was intoxicating, a sharp, jagged contrast to the safe, sanitized affection she received at home. Marcus leaned in further, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that scraped against her nerves like sandpaper. "The system is full of holes, Elizabeth. But the biggest vulnerability isn't in the code." He paused, letting the implication hang in the dark, blue-lit room. "The only real vulnerability Richard has is standing right here in this room," and he left the door wide open. It was not a flirtation, it was a declaration of intent, a statement of ownership that bypassed consent and went straight to possession. He was telling her that she was the flaw in the system, and that he had already exploited the breach. Elizabeth stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, realizing that the security of her marriage had just been shattered. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, a heavy, suffocating blanket of illicit promise. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. In the reflection of the monitors behind him, she saw herself not as the CEO's wife, but as the target of a successful raid. 7 days had passed since the incident in the security hub, a week defined by a silence that was louder than any scream. Elizabeth found herself drawn back to the obsidian tower of the corporation, but this time the context had shifted entirely from the sterile light of midday to the clandestine shadows of late evening. The city outside was draped in a heavy, suffocating darkness, broken only by the artificial constellations of streetlights and skyscrapers. It was a Tuesday, the night of the annual Tech for Tomorrow charity gala, an event that Richard, with his desperate need for public validation and philanthropic clout, could not possibly miss. He was currently miles away on the other side of the metropolis, wearing a tuxedo that fit him poorly, smiling for cameras and shaking hands with donors, secure in the belief that his wife was resting at home with a migraine. The deception felt intoxicatingly easy, a second skin that Elizabeth had slipped into with disturbing comfort. She had parked her car 3 blocks away in an underground structure used by the cleaning crews, trading her usual valet service for anonymity. Walking through the cool night air, she felt a vibration of nerves that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the adrenaline of the hunt. She was no longer the trophy wife coming to support her husband, she was a conspirator entering enemy territory. The towering structure of glass and steel loomed above her, stripping away the pretense of civilization to reveal the cold, hard lines of power that defined her husband's world, a world she was about to subvert from the inside out. Marcus was waiting for her not at the main revolving doors with their biometric scanners and sleepy night guards, but at the heavy, reinforced service entrance located in the loading dock alley. The environment here was gritty, smelling of diesel fumes and damp concrete, a stark contrast to the perfumed air of the penthouse. He did not look like a corporate executive tonight. He was dressed in dark, tactical clothing that blurred the lines between security professional and military operator. He stood in the shadows, almost invisible until she was right in front of him, his presence radiating a controlled, lethal energy that made her breath hitch. There were no pleasantries, no soft words of greeting. He simply nodded, a sharp, efficient gesture, and swiped a master keycard across the reader. The heavy steel door hissed open, granting them access to the bowels of the building. As they stepped inside, Marcus immediately moved to a keypad on the wall, his fingers dancing over the buttons with practiced speed. He wasn't just unlocking doors, he was blinding the building. With a few keystrokes, he looped the camera feeds for the service corridor and the executive elevator, freezing the image of an empty hallway for any guard who might be watching the monitors. It was a display of dominance over the technology that Richard prided himself on, a silent demonstration that the fortress was only as strong as the men guarding it. Elizabeth watched him work, fascinated by the ease with which he dismantled the digital barriers, realizing that to him, Richard's empire was nothing more than a series of tumblers to be picked. They bypassed the gleaming main lobby entirely, taking the service elevator that was usually reserved for freight and maintenance crews. The car was large, industrial, and smelled faintly of oil and harsh cleaning chemicals, lacking the polished mirrors and soft music of the guest lifts. The ascent was rapid and jarring, the mechanism groaning softly as it hoisted them upward through the spine of the building. In the confined space, the physical tension between them spiked. Marcus stood close to her, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He stared straight ahead at the brushed metal doors, his jaw set, behaving less like a lover and more like an escort taking a high-value asset into a secure zone. When the doors parted on the executive floor, the silence was absolute. The hallway, usually bustling with assistants and junior executives hoping to catch the CEO's eye, was now a long, dimly lit tunnel of expensive carpet and muted abstract art. The air conditioning hummed a low, constant note, the heartbeat of the dormant building. Walking down the corridor felt like trespassing in a mausoleum dedicated to capitalism. Every step Elizabeth took sank into the plush flooring, muffling the sound of her arrival. She glanced at the dark offices passing by, glass cubes where people spent their lives building Richard's fortune, and felt a surge of contempt for the order and rules that governed this place. They reached the double doors of the CEO's suite, the holy of holies where the decisions that moved markets were made. Marcus didn't hesitate, he pushed the doors open with a familiarity that bordered on arrogance. The room beyond was cavernous, illuminated only by the ambient glow of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It smelled of leather, aged paper, and Richard's expensive, antiseptic cologne. To Elizabeth, the room had always felt like a showroom, a place where she was expected to sit still and look pretty while men talked business. Tonight, however, the shadows twisted the familiar shapes of the furniture into something new, something that belonged to the night and to the man standing beside her. The centerpiece of the room was the massive oak desk, a slab of timber that looked like it could withstand a bomb blast. It was cluttered with the debris of Richard's mind, stacks of schematics, unread reports, tablets charging in a row, and half-empty cups of coffee. It was a testament to his disorganized genius, a chaotic altar to his work ethic. Marcus walked around the desk, his hand trailing over the surface, brushing aside a stack of legal documents with a dismissive sweep of his arm. He moved with the entitlement of a conqueror surveying the spoils of war. He wasn't visiting the boss's office, he was occupying it. He looked at the ergonomic leather chair that Richard treated like a throne, and then he looked at Elizabeth, his eyes dark and commanding. "Sit," he ordered, the single word cutting through the stillness of the room. It wasn't a request. He gestured to Richard's chair, the seat of authority in the company. Elizabeth hesitated for only a fraction of a second before obeying. As she lowered herself into the leather, she felt the ghost of her husband's presence, the way the chair was adjusted to his height, the indentation of his weight. It felt wrong, perverse, and utterly thrilling. Marcus gripped the armrests and spun the chair around, forcing her to face the panoramic window. The city lay spread out below them, a sprawling grid of millions of lights, a galaxy of electricity that Richard believed he controlled. "Look at it," Marcus whispered, leaning over her shoulder, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "He sits here and thinks he owns the world because he can see it from above. He thinks distance gives him power." His hands moved from the armrests to rest on her shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress with a possessive weight. "But he's not here, Elizabeth. He's down there, begging for money and applause from strangers, while I'm standing in his castle." The dichotomy was sharp and brutal. Richard was out playing the role of the benevolent public figure, while his private sanctuary was being systematically violated by the very man he paid to secure it. Marcus reached over her shoulder and picked up a heavy silver picture frame from the desk. It was a photograph taken 2 years ago at a ski resort in Aspen, capturing a moment of fabricated happiness. In the image, Richard and Elizabeth were smiling, their cheeks flushed with cold, wearing matching designer gear. It was the quintessential image of a happy, successful marriage, the kind of photo that was meant to be displayed to convince the world that everything was perfect. Marcus held it in front of her for a moment, forcing her to look at her own frozen smile, at the lie she had been living. Then, with a casual, almost bored flick of his wrist, he dropped it. The sound of the frame hitting the hardwood floor was shocking in the quiet room. The glass shattered instantly, a jagged spiderweb of cracks obscuring Richard's face while leaving Elizabeth's untouched. It was a violent, symbolic act of erasure. Marcus didn't even look down at the debris. He grabbed the back of the chair and pulled it away from the window, spinning her back toward the desk, toward him. The destruction of the photograph seemed to snap the last tether of restraint holding the atmosphere together. The air in the room thickened, charged with a raw, electric tension that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. The pretense of a social visit, of a tour, was over. He moved around the desk, clearing a space not by organizing the papers, but by shoving them onto the floor. High-level merger contracts, security audits, and financial projections fluttered to the ground like confetti. He lifted Elizabeth from the chair and placed her onto the edge of the heavy oak desk, her position elevated, placing her physically above the ruins of Richard's work. The first touch was not gentle, it was claiming. His hands were rough, seeking, erasing the memory of Richard's tentative, scheduled intimacy. Here, in the heart of the corporate machine, amidst the blinking lights of the routers and the silent hum of the servers in the adjacent room, there was no room for tenderness. The encounter was swift, fueled by the adrenaline of the risk they were taking. Every sound, the rustle of clothing, the sharp intake of breath, the creak of the desk, seemed amplified in the acoustic perfection of the office. Elizabeth's head fell back, her eyes catching the blinking red light of a smoke detector on the ceiling, the only witness to their betrayal. She felt a profound sense of dissociation, as if the woman who hosted dinner parties and discussed thread counts was dying, replaced by a creature of instinct and need. This wasn't just adultery, it was an exorcism. With every movement, Marcus was driving Richard out of the room, out of her mind, and out of her body, replacing the intellectual void of her marriage with an overwhelming physical reality. The sound of the servers in the connecting IT closet provided a rhythmic, mechanical soundtrack to their union, a constant drone of data being processed, ignorant of the human chaos unfolding just a few feet away. It was a jarring juxtaposition, the cold, logical world of binary code and algorithms colliding with the hot, messy, analog reality of lust and betrayal. Marcus leaned in close, his face buried in her neck, his voice a harsh whisper against her skin. He wasn't whispering endearments, he was whispering instructions, commands, asserting his dominance not just over her, but over the very space they occupied. He was marking his territory in the most primal way possible, right on top of the symbols of Richard's civilized power. As the intensity of the moment crested, Elizabeth's hand blindly grasped the edge of the desk, her fingers curling around the cold wood. Her gaze fell to the floor, where the shattered picture frame lay. Through the spiderweb of broken glass, she could see Richard's smiling face looking up at them, oblivious and pathetic. A wave of dark triumph washed over her, mixing with the pleasure. She wasn't the victim of a seduction, she was a willing participant in a coup. The fear of getting caught had transmuted into a powerful weapon, sharpening her senses. She realized in that moment that she didn't want to leave this room, didn't want to return to the safety of the penthouse. When it was over, the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy and profound. The city lights still twinkled indifferently outside, and the servers still hummed their monotonous tune. Marcus stepped back, adjusting his clothes with the same efficient, tactical precision he had used to disable the cameras. He didn't look guilty, he looked satisfied. He picked up the broken frame, inspecting the damage with a detached curiosity, before tossing it into the waste bin under the desk. Collateral damage, he muttered, the military terminology sounding perfectly natural in the quiet office. Elizabeth slid off the desk, her legs trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of the intensity. She smoothed her dress, but she knew she couldn't smooth over what had just happened to her soul. The good wife had been dismantled, left in pieces alongside the scattered papers on the floor. She looked at Marcus, then at the empty chair where Richard usually sat master of his universe. The room looked the same, yet everything had changed. The desk was no longer a workspace, it was a crime scene, and she was the accomplice. As they prepared to leave, resetting the room to a semblance of order, Elizabeth felt a cold, hard resolve settling in her chest. This wasn't just an affair anymore, it was a takeover. The culmination of their reckless spiraling into the abyss arrived exactly 1 month later, on the day marked in red on every corporate calendar, the quarterly financial report. It was a day of high tension and performative efficiency, where the fate of stock options and departmental budgets hung on the trajectory of a laser pointer. Richard was physically absent from the headquarters, having flown to London 3 days prior to court a potential European conglomerate for a strategic partnership. However, his absence did not mean silence, in fact, his presence was more overwhelming than if he had been standing in the room. The main wall of his executive office, usually reserved for abstract art or the view of the skyline, had been transformed into a digital shrine. A massive, high-definition screen, spanning nearly 10 feet across, flickered to life, turning the private sanctuary into a global command center. The room was bathed in the cool, artificial blue light of the monitor, casting long, sharp shadows across the expensive furniture. On the screen, Richard appeared larger than life, his head and shoulders filling the frame like a benevolent, bespectacled deity addressing his subjects. He was sitting in a hotel suite in London, the time difference evident in the slight grey cast to his skin and the way he leaned too close to the camera lens. Despite the late hour in the United Kingdom, he was manic with energy, fueled by caffeine and the thrill of the deal. His voice, amplified by the surround sound speakers embedded in the office ceiling, boomed through the empty space, bouncing off the glass walls. He was speaking to the board of directors, who were logged in from various locations, but the primary feed was routed here, to his home base, where he believed he was recording a masterclass in leadership. Elizabeth and Marcus were in the room, but they existed in the shadows, occupying the only space that Richard's digital eye could not see. The camera mounted atop the massive screen had a wide-angle lens designed to capture the conference table and the main seating area, but it had a blind spot directly beneath it and slightly to the left. There, a low-slung, Italian leather sofa for casual meetings sat in a precise zone of invisibility. Marcus, with his intimate knowledge of every sensor and lens in the building, had positioned them there with the calculated precision of a sniper. They were less than 10 feet away from the screen, close enough to see the pores on Richard's digital face, yet to him, the room appeared completely empty, a silent vessel waiting for his return. The audacity of the arrangement was breathtaking. They were not hiding in a closet or sneaking around in the dark, they were lounging in the full glare of the monitor's light, protected only by the geometry of the camera lens. Richard was midway through a passionate monologue about vertical integration and optimizing the synergy between security protocols and user experience. His voice was crisp, distorted slightly by the compression of the video feed, but every inflection of his arrogance was perfectly preserved. He waved his hands, pointing at graphs that appeared as picture-in-picture overlays, completely oblivious to the fact that his audience of two was engaging in a betrayal that mocked every word he spoke about transparency and control. Marcus sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture relaxed but his eyes burning with a dark, predatory focus. He was fully dressed, his tactical belt unbuckled but still wrapped around his waist, a reminder of his role as the guardian of the gate. Elizabeth sat beside him, her knees weak, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that seemed to sync with the pulsing blue light from the screen. The air in the room was thick with a suffocating mixture of fear and arousal. The danger was no longer abstract, it was staring them in the face, pixelated and loud. Every time Richard paused for breath, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush them. "I want you to look at him," Marcus commanded, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that slid under the booming audio of the presentation. He didn't touch her yet, he simply issued the order, testing the depth of her submission. Elizabeth turned her head, forcing herself to look at the giant, glowing face of her husband. Richard was smiling now, a tight, triumphant expression as he touted a 20% increase in efficiency. Seeing him like this, flattened into 2 dimensions and comprised of light and code, he looked strangely fragile. He was a ghost in his own machine, a collection of data points pretending to be a man, while the reality of flesh and blood was unfolding in the blind spot he had paid for. Marcus reached out, his large, rough hand moving with agonizing slowness to the top button of her silk blouse. He didn't rush, he treated the moment with the deliberate pacing of a bomb disposal technician. His eyes never left her face, watching her reaction as he undid the first button, then the second. The fabric parted, exposing her skin to the cool, conditioned air of the office. Elizabeth felt a shiver violently traverse her spine, a physical reaction to the collision of worlds. In her ears, Richard was droning on about impenetrable firewalls, while on her skin, Marcus's fingers were dismantling her defenses with terrifying ease. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying, threatening to make her faint. "He talks so much about seeing everything," Marcus murmured, leaning in close enough that his lips brushed the shell of her ear. "But he doesn't see this. He doesn't see you." The words were a poison and a cure, validating her feelings of neglect while sealing her complicity in his humiliation. He pushed the blouse off her shoulders, the silk pooling at her waist. Elizabeth felt exposed, not just physically, but existentially. She was naked before the husband who couldn't see her and the lover who saw too much. Marcus pulled her closer, his grip firm and possessive, anchoring her in the physical realm while Richard floated in the digital ether. The physical act that followed was driven by a cruel, primal necessity. It wasn't about romance, it was about erasure. Marcus moved with a rhythmic intensity that stood in stark contrast to the staccato, erratic tempo of Richard's speech. Every touch was a claim, a stamp of ownership placed directly under the nose of the rightful owner. Elizabeth found herself trapped between two frequencies, the intellectual, sterile frequency of her husband's ambitions and the guttural, heavy frequency of Marcus's desire. She gripped Marcus's shoulders, her fingernails digging into the fabric of his shirt, using him as a lifeline to keep from drowning in the surrealism of the moment. Then came the moment that stopped her heart. On the screen, Richard suddenly stopped speaking. He leaned forward, his face filling the entire wall, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to peer through the camera and into the room. "Are there any questions from the floor regarding the Q3 projections?" he asked. The audio feed was live. The microphone on the conference table, though technically muted by the software, was a piece of hardware that Marcus had manipulated. For a split second, Elizabeth didn't know if they were truly silent. The pause that followed was an eternity. The room was dead quiet, save for the ragged sound of their breathing and the wet, slick sounds of their bodies moving together. Elizabeth clamped her hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in terror. She was on the verge of a scream or a moan, she couldn't tell which. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. Richard waited, his digital eyes scanning the empty chairs he could see, completely unaware that just below his line of sight, his wife was being taken by his employee. The silence stretched, taut as a piano wire. Marcus didn't stop, in fact, he increased the intensity, challenging her to stay quiet, daring the universe to expose them. He watched the screen with a look of utter contempt, thrusting into her with a force that shook the sofa, mocking the man who was waiting for a polite corporate response. "I assume silence means approval," Richard finally said, leaning back with a satisfied smirk, breaking the tension but not the act. "Excellent. Let's move to the security audit." He clicked a button, and a new slide appeared, covering his face with a complex diagram of network nodes. Elizabeth let out a shuddering breath against her palm, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. It wasn't sorrow, it was the sheer, overwhelming release of survival. The risk had been absolute, the proximity to disaster measured in inches and decibels. The contrast was now absolute. Richard, reduced to a voice and a spreadsheet, was discussing the theoretical safety of his empire, while Marcus was physically dismantling the sanctity of his marriage in real time. Richard sounded small, tinny, and distant, a pixelated figurehead shouting into the void. Marcus, by comparison, was heat, weight, and undeniable reality. He was the force of nature that Richard's algorithms couldn't predict. As the meeting dragged on, the humiliation of the husband became the fuel for the lovers. They were desecrating his temple while he preached from the pulpit, and the knowledge that he was paying for the bandwidth to broadcast his own cuckoldry added a layer of dark, twisted irony that changed Elizabeth forever. She looked at the screen, at the diagrams of safety, and realized there was no safety left, only this raw, terrifying freedom in the dark. Upon Richard's return from London, the atmosphere within the glass-walled headquarters seemed to have undergone a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, like the drop in barometric pressure before a storm. To the casual observer, the hive of activity remained unchanged. Analysts still scurried with tablets, stocks still scrolled across the ticker in the lobby, and the coffee machine still hissed with steam. However, Richard, whose mind was trained to detect anomalies in code and market trends, felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck the moment he stepped out of the elevator. The air felt thinner, sharper, charged with a static electricity that hadn't been there before his departure. He paused in the hallway, adjusting his glasses, trying to isolate the variable that was causing this intuitive dissonance, but for the first time in his career, the data did not yield an immediate answer. His analytical mind, desperate for order, immediately began to categorize and rationalize these feelings, dismissing the visceral warning signs as symptoms of his own fatigue. He attributed the heavy silence in his own home to Elizabeth's accumulation of stress during his absence, convincing himself that her chilly demeanor was merely a reaction to his workaholic schedule. Similarly, he interpreted the new, hardened edge in Marcus's behavior not as hostility, but as a heightened state of professional focus. In Richard's binary worldview, a security chief who smiled was a security chief who was not doing his job. Therefore, Marcus's cold, distant efficiency was simply a return on investment. He told himself that the tension he felt was the price of excellence, never suspecting that the silence around him was not peace, but the held breath of a predator before the strike. Driven by a paranoia that had been festering since the merger talks began, Richard made a decision that would seal his fate with tragic irony. He summoned Marcus to his office, not to reprimand him, but to promote him to the inner circle of trust. Terrified of corporate espionage and the possibility of competitors digging into his private affairs to derail the deal, Richard ordered a level 5 audit of his own life. He instructed Marcus to secure everything: his personal correspondence, his private vaults, and, most crucially, his legal archives. He handed over the digital keys and physical combinations to the very wolf he had invited into the fold, believing he was fortifying the gates when, in reality, he was handing over the blueprints to the demolition team. Marcus accepted the assignment with a stoic nod, his face a mask of dutiful obedience that concealed a dark, triumphant amusement. The moment he was granted administrative access to Richard's private cloud and the physical safe in the penthouse library, the nature of the game changed from a physical affair to a forensic dismantling. Marcus did not use his new clearance to hunt for external spies or hidden microphones planted by rivals. Instead, he brought the digital spoils to Elizabeth. They spent their evenings not in bed, but huddled over a tablet in the dimly lit security office, dissecting the complex legal architecture that Richard had built to protect his fortune. The object of their intense study was the prenuptial agreement, a document Richard had always regarded as ironclad. The contract was a masterpiece of legal cynicism, designed to leave Elizabeth with nothing in the event of a standard divorce. However, Marcus, with his tactical mind, approached the document not as a lawyer, but as a strategist looking for a weak point in a fortress wall. He and Elizabeth pored over the dense legalese, searching for ambiguities, for subjective terms that could be weaponized. They found their ammunition in the clauses regarding constructive abandonment and hostile domestic environment. The language was vague enough to be open to interpretation, provided there was sufficient evidence to support the claim. They realized that they didn't need to break the contract, they needed to force Richard to violate its behavioral stipulations without him even knowing he was doing it. A new, insidious dynamic began to take shape within the penthouse, orchestrated entirely by the lovers. Elizabeth, emboldened by Marcus's presence and the secret plan they were weaving, shed the skin of the submissive, supportive wife. She began to weaponize the domestic space, introducing subtle chaotic elements into Richard's rigidly controlled life. She would forget to pass on important messages, reorganize his files in a way that made no sense, or make offhand, cutting remarks about his leadership style during dinner. These were not random acts of frustration, they were calculated jabs designed to pierce Richard's composure at his most vulnerable moments, specifically when he was exhausted from work and his defenses were low. The goal was to provoke a reaction, and Richard, already frayed by the pressures of the impending merger, was an easy target. The first major incident occurred on a Tuesday evening, following a particularly grueling conference call with investors. Elizabeth picked a fight over something trivial, the temperature of the wine or a perceived slight at a gala months ago, but she escalated it with surgical precision. She questioned his competence, mocked his obsession with numbers, and compared him unfavorably to the real men who actually built things with their hands. It was a direct attack on his ego, designed to trigger the latent narcissism and aggression that usually lay dormant beneath his geeky exterior. Richard snapped. The explosion was visceral and ugly. He stood up from the table, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red, and unleashed a tirade of verbal abuse. He shouted about his genius, about how he carried the weight of the world, and how she was nothing without his money. He threw a crystal glass against the wall, the shattering sound echoing through the cavernous apartment like a gunshot. In that moment, he looked every bit the tyrant, unhinged, threatening, and violent. He felt a momentary surge of release, a venting of the pressure valve, completely unaware that this outburst was not a private moment of weakness, but a public performance for an audience of one. Marcus was watching. He was not in the room, but he was present through the very eyes that Richard had paid to install. The smart home security system, upgraded with high-definition cameras and high-fidelity microphones to protect the family from intruders, was now the primary witness for the prosecution. Marcus sat in the server room, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his eyes, recording every frame of Richard's meltdown. He adjusted the audio levels to ensure the threats were crystal clear, ensuring that Richard's voice was the dominant sound in the mix. The technology that was supposed to keep the world out was now trapping Richard inside a digital cage of his own making. The days that followed settled into a terrifying pattern of provocation and documentation. Elizabeth played her part with the skill of an actress, alternating between icy silence and sharp, stinging barbs that she knew would elicit a response. She knew exactly where to press to make him hurt, and exactly when to retreat to make him chase her with his anger. Each argument was staged in a room with optimal camera coverage. If Richard tried to argue in the hallway, she would walk into the living room, drawing him into the frame like a spider drawing a fly into a web. She was no longer a victim of his neglect, she was the director of his downfall, creating a narrative of fear and intimidation that would hold up in any court of law. Richard, oblivious to the trap, believed he was simply going through a rough patch in his marriage due to stress. He rationalized his outbursts as the natural reaction of a man under immense pressure, telling himself that Elizabeth was being unreasonable and hysterical. He even confided in Marcus, expressing regret for his temper but justifying it by citing the lack of support he felt at home. He asked Marcus to ensure that the security logs were kept strictly private, fearing that a leak of his domestic troubles could hurt the company's stock price. He had no idea that by giving this instruction, he was essentially asking his executioner to sharpen the axe. Marcus nodded sympathetically, promising absolute discretion while saving the files to an encrypted external drive. The brilliance of the scheme lay in its use of Richard's own resources against him. Marcus conducted the audit of the assets by meticulously cataloging every offshore account and hidden trust, information that would be vital for the alimony settlement. He used the company's legal software to research precedents for breaking prenuptial agreements based on emotional abuse. He used the corporate expense account to buy the encrypted drives where the evidence was stored. Richard was financing the investigation into himself, signing the invoices for the security consulting hours that were actually spent plotting his financial and personal ruin. Every dollar he spent to secure his empire was actually purchasing the weapons that would be used to conquer it. As the weeks went by, the dossier on Richard grew thicker. It wasn't just the video footage, it was a carefully curated collection of data points. Marcus archived emails where Richard spoke disparagingly of his wife to his lawyers. He saved logs of the smart home system showing Richard locking doors or cutting off internet access during arguments, petty acts of control that, when compiled, painted a portrait of a coercive, controlling sociopath. They were building a mosaic of a monster, using pieces of the truth to construct a lie that was legally irrefutable. Richard was being framed by his own actions, stripped of context and presented in the harsh, unforgiving light of forensic evidence. Richard felt the walls closing in, but his analytical mind looked in the wrong direction. He doubled the security patrols around the building, fearing corporate saboteurs. He had the IT department sweep the network for bugs, fearing hackers. He lay awake at night, worrying about the Asian investors and the European regulators, completely blind to the fact that the true threat was sleeping in the guest room down the hall and standing guard in the lobby. He was a captain obsessively scanning the horizon for enemy ships while his first mate was busy drilling holes in the hull of his own vessel. The tragedy of his situation was compounded by his arrogance. He believed he was the smartest person in any room, the architect of the system, the master of the code. He could not conceive of a world where a grunt like Marcus or a trophy like Elizabeth could outmaneuver him. He viewed them as variables he could control, assets he owned. This hubris was his blindfold. He didn't see the look of shared understanding between them when they passed each other in the hallway. He didn't notice the subtle synchronization of their movements. He remained isolated in his tower of intellect, disconnected from the primal, emotional currents that were swirling around him, dragging him down. By the end of the month, the trap was fully primed. The audit was complete, but the report Marcus prepared for Richard was a fiction, a sanitized document full of technical jargon and all clear signals. The real report, the collection of videos, financial data, and legal loopholes, was sitting in a safe deposit box that only Elizabeth and Marcus could access. Richard signed off on the final payments for the security upgrade, thanking Marcus for his diligence and loyalty. He sat in his office, surrounded by screens, feeling a false sense of security, unaware that he had just authorized the final transaction in the purchase of his own destruction. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the script was written. All that remained was for the curtain to fall. The evening of the 10th wedding anniversary arrived not with the warmth of a celebration, but with the calculated precision of a theatrical production, staged within the glass walls of the penthouse. The air was thick with the scent of imported lilies and the murmuring of the city's elite, board members, investors, and carefully curated friends, who stood holding flutes of vintage champagne. Richard had spared no expense, transforming their home into a showroom for his success, oblivious to the fact that he was merely financing the venue for his own execution. He moved through the crowd with a manic energy, his tuxedo slightly ill-fitting around the shoulders, his eyes darting behind his thick glasses as he checked the time on his smartwatch, ensuring the schedule was adhered to down to the second. At precisely 8 o'clock, Richard tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon, the sharp chime cutting through the ambient chatter and drawing the room's attention to the center of the living room. He stood before a large, veiled screen, beaming with the pride of an inventor about to unveil his masterpiece. He began his speech not by praising his wife's beauty or their shared history, but by talking about optimization, security, and the future of domestic integration. He spoke of love as a variable that could be protected by algorithms, a sentiment that drew polite, confused applause from the guests who expected a romantic toast rather than a tech keynote. With a dramatic flourish, Richard pressed a button on a remote control, and the veil dropped to reveal a dashboard displaying a complex, rotating 3D model of the penthouse. He announced that his anniversary gift to Elizabeth was not jewelry or a vacation, but the Elizabeth Protocol, a fully integrated, AI-driven smart home system named in her honor. He explained, with deafening tone deafness, that this system would anticipate her every need, monitor her health vitals, and secure her environment with military-grade encryption. He had essentially gifted her a digital prison, wrapping his controlling nature in the guise of protective benevolence, unaware that the very sensors he bragged about had already been weaponized against him. When the applause died down, the spotlight shifted to Elizabeth, who was seated on a velvet love seat, looking statuesque in a dress that cost more than most cars. She did not smile, her expression was one of serene, icy detachment. Slowly, she rose to her feet, the silk of her gown rustling in the sudden silence. She did not hold a glass of champagne to return the toast. Instead, she reached behind a cushion and produced a thick, leather-bound legal folder. The room grew uncomfortably quiet, the guests sensing a deviation from the script that no algorithm could have predicted. As if on a silent cue, a figure emerged from the periphery of the room, stepping out of the shadows near the corridor leading to the master suite. It was not a waiter, and it was certainly not the uniformed security guard the guests might have expected to see in the background. It was Marcus. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his broad, muscular frame with a perfection Richard could never achieve. He moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a panther entering a clearing, coming to stand just behind Elizabeth's right shoulder. His presence was a physical shock to the room. He radiated a dominance and a possession that made Richard's technological posturing look like a child's game. Elizabeth opened the folder, her voice steady and amplified by the very acoustics Richard had perfected for his presentation. She did not thank him for the gift. Instead, she announced, clearly and without a tremor, that she was filing for an immediate divorce. A gasp rippled through the assembled crowd, followed by a stunned silence. Richard's smile froze, then shattered, replaced by a look of pale confusion that quickly hardened into defensive anger. He laughed nervously, looking around at his guests as if this were a joke, but the look in Marcus's eyes told him that the punchline was going to be lethal. Recovering his composure, Richard straightened his spine and adopted the arrogant tone he used in boardrooms when dismissing hostile takeovers. He reminded Elizabeth, loudly enough for the lawyers in the room to hear, of the ironclad prenuptial agreement they had signed 10 years ago. He sneered that she would leave with nothing, that his fortune was protected by layers of trusts and clauses designed for exactly this scenario. He felt safe within the walls of his legal fortress, believing that money and contracts were the ultimate reality, invincible against mere emotion. Elizabeth waited for him to finish, her expression pitying. With a cold smile, she turned a page in the folder and cited Clause 12.4 of that very agreement. She read the text aloud. The clause stipulated that the prenup would be nullified in the event of proven, systematic emotional alienation and failure to provide a safe psychological environment, resulting in constructive abandonment. Richard scoffed, calling it a subjective fantasy that no judge would uphold. But Elizabeth was already pulling out the next document, a sworn affidavit signed by the head of corporate security, Marcus himself. Marcus stepped forward, his voice a deep baritone that commanded absolute attention. He stated for the record that, in his professional capacity, he had witnessed and documented a pattern of erratic, aggressive, and psychologically damaging behavior from the CEO toward his wife. He gestured to the screen Richard had just used. The evidence, he explained, was harvested from the very security system Richard had installed. The Elizabeth protocol had indeed been recording everything, every angry outburst Richard had made when provoked, every shattered glass, every locked door. Stripped of context, the footage depicted Richard not as a stressed executive, but as a volatile tyrant, while Elizabeth appeared as the silent, terrified victim. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He realized with a dawning horror that his own obsession with surveillance had been turned into the instrument of his character assassination. But the final blow was yet to come. Elizabeth produced a document that Richard recognized, a thick stack of papers he had signed 2 months ago during the security audit Marcus had recommended. He had signed them without reading the fine print, believing them to be routine asset protection measures against corporate espionage. Elizabeth explained the reality of that signature. Hidden within the dense legal jargon of the Asset Security Update was a provision that transferred the controlling interest of his primary stock portfolio into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary of this trust was not the corporation, but Elizabeth herself, designated as the primary guardian of domestic stability in the event of a security crisis. By signing that document, Richard had legally agreed that his wife needed financial independence to feel safe from the threats he had been paranoid about. He had not just opened the door, he had handed them the deed to the house. The room was deathly silent. Richard looked at his guests, seeing not sympathy, but the cold calculation of business people realizing the king was dead. He looked at Marcus, the man he had paid to protect his life, and saw the smirk of the man who had stolen it. He looked at Elizabeth, the woman he thought he owned, and saw a stranger who had outsmarted him at his own game. The realization crushed him, he was the architect of his own ruin. He had funded the investigation, installed the cameras, and signed the transfer. It was a perfect, closed loop of self-destruction. Marcus extended his arm, and Elizabeth took it, her fingers resting lightly on the fine wool of his suit sleeve. They did not look back at the devastated man standing amidst the ruins of his anniversary party. They turned and walked toward the private elevator, a united front of beauty and strength leaving behind the weakness of intellect and ego. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing them off from the penthouse, Richard was left alone in the center of the room, surrounded by his millions of pixels and zero leverage. In the weeks that followed, the legal community would marvel at the elegance of the coup. Richard's high-priced lawyers would tear their hair out, finding no way to pierce the armor of the documents he had signed of his own free will. The evidence of emotional distress was corroborated by the unimpeachable testimony of a security expert with a military background. The stock transfer was ironclad. Richard remained in his tower, a wealthy prisoner of his own success, forced to pay monthly dividends to the woman who was now living a life of passion and luxury with his former employee. On paper, everything was flawless, a testament to the fact that in the cold world of contracts and codes, the heartless often win by simply following the rules.